For almost 18 years, South Carolina told this story the same way. Two enslaved men disappeared into the night, and the planter's twin daughters vanished with them. The official version was clean. The men had kidnapped the girls. The truth, if the hidden diary, the ship manifest, and the journal found more than a century later are to be believed, was far more dangerous. The daughters lit the fire themselves. This is the buried case of the Harrow sisters of Marshgate, a low-country rice estate where wealth stood on stolen labor, where appearances mattered more than mercy, and where 4 young people stepped into the dark rather than keep living inside a lie. In the spring of 1851, Marshgate Plantation sat above the tidal flats of the Beaufort district, its white galleries facing rows of flooded rice fields that glittered like polished metal at sundown. The house looked serene from a distance. Up close, it was a monument to discipline. Every hour was accounted for. Every body was ranked. Every silence meant something. Nathaniel Harrow ruled the place. He was a widower, ambitious, church-going in public, merciless in private, the kind of man neighbors described as stable because the violence of his world was so ordinary to them they no longer called it violence. His fortune rested on rice, on shipping contracts, and on the labor of more than 60 enslaved people who kept Marshgate alive in heat, flood, fever, and mud. Nathaniel's daughters, Evelyn and Marion Harrow, had turned 21 that February. They were identical enough to confuse strangers, with the same pale oval faces, the same gray eyes, the same dark hair pinned tightly at the nape. But the likeness ended there. Evelyn moved through rooms with a careful stillness, as if she had learned early that silence could be a kind of armor. Marion was warmer, quicker, more openly restless, though even she knew how to perform the obedience their world demanded. To their neighbors, the sisters were prizes. Educated, polished, unmarried longer than expected, but still valuable within the narrow market of alliances and land. To Nathaniel, they were not simply daughters. They were the final pieces in a family strategy. Marriages could extend contracts, merge acreage, repair rivalries, and harden the Harrow name into something that might outlive him. What almost no one outside Marshgate understood was that the estate had begun to warp from the inside. The first hint came in a letter written by the housekeeper, Agnes Doyle, to a cousin in Charleston. It was never meant for history. It was domestic, nosy, half-bored. But one line would matter later. The young ladies, she wrote, had developed an odd habit of lingering at dusk near the carriage sheds and old Cooper's yard, and the master seemed not to notice, or perhaps preferred not to. The ornamental live oaks and shell pads of the main house stood the working world Nathaniel barely saw unless something went wrong. The mill house, the stables, the Cooper's lean-to, the rows of cabins, the workshops that smelled of wet wood, iron, lamp smoke, and sweat. That was where the sisters' lives collided with 2 men whose names the official story tried hardest to erase. The first was Isaac. Plantation ledgers described him as a stable hand, age 28, sound, reliable. The ledgers did not mention that he could read. They did not mention that he had learned letters as a child from the son of a previous owner in North Carolina, nor that he had spent years hiding that skill because literacy in an enslaved man was not treated as an achievement, but as a threat. The second was Jonah, a year or 2 younger, assigned to repair floodgates, fencing, and tools along the rice embankments. He had a carpenter's hands and a habit of watching before he spoke. Later testimony would suggest he too knew how to write, carefully, sparingly, enough to leave notes small enough to hide in hymns and hymnals. However this began, it did not begin as a fantasy. That part matters. The world of Marshgate was not a love story waiting to happen. It was a slave estate. The balance of danger was grotesquely unequal. If Nathaniel Harrow suspected flirtation from his daughters, the shame would fall on the family. If he suspected attachment from Isaac or Jonah, the punishment would fall first and hardest on the men. And yet, somewhere inside that brutal arrangement, recognition took place. According to Marion's diary, found in 1959 behind a false panel in what had once been her bedroom wall, She first noticed Isaac because she caught him reading from a torn page of a shipping circular in the harness room. He did not beg. He did not invent an excuse. He simply folded the paper and waited for whatever came next. Marian wrote that she expected fear in him and was unsettled when she saw something else instead. A measured calm. A refusal to perform ignorance for her comfort. She returned the next evening. Then again after that. At first, the meetings were brief. A line from scripture. A question about a word. A scrap of newspaper carried in under kindling. Then they lengthened. What began as curiosity became conversation. Conversation became dependence. Not the sentimental kind, but the kind that grows when one person shatters the lies another has been raised inside. Evelyn's path toward Jonah seems to have been slower. Family letters recovered decades later suggest she met him while he was repairing storm-damaged shutters on the West Gallery. He spoke little, but he carved small objects from cypress scraps, birds, fishing floats, once a tiny church, and left them where children might find them. Evelyn noticed his work before she spoke to him directly. Then, over months, she found reasons to pass the tool shed, to ask needless questions, to remain where she did not need to remain. Marian's diary never pretends these choices were innocent. That is one reason historians took it seriously. She wrote not as a girl, swept into romance, but as someone slowly understanding the moral architecture of the world that had produced her. One entry from November 1850 is especially stark. I had believed kindness and ownership could inhabit the same room, she wrote. Now I see that ownership poisons whatever it touches. The sisters did not awaken at the same speed, but once they recognized what slavery was, they could no longer interact with Isaac and Jonah as if the old terms still held. What followed was not simple, and it should not be made simple now. Affection grew, yes. So did intellectual intimacy. So did trust. So did terror. Because once feeling entered the picture, so did consequence. In the winter of 1850 into 1851, the Lowcountry was hit by an unusual run of cold. Roads turned slick. The tidal air cut harder than usual. Travel slowed. Visitors thinned. The house grew quieter. Inside that quiet, the secret deepened. Small notes were hidden inside a psalm book and beneath the lining of Marian's workbasket. One fragment, preserved in a later family archive, appears to set the terms for a midnight meeting in the old rice barn. No names, only initials, and one line that still lands like a hammer. 4 souls cannot remain divided forever. That line changed the entire shape of the case. It meant the sisters were not hiding separate scandals. They were acting together. Whether they spoke in whispers at night, whether they passed information across the dinner table without their father seeing, whether one found courage only because the other already had it. By early 1851, the evidence suggests they had formed a shared plan. And then Nathaniel Harrow made the choice that forced their hand. At supper on February 23rd, with candles burning low, and the silver laid out as if ceremony itself could make obedience easier, he announced he had settled their futures. Evelyn was to marry the eldest son of a rice factor near Georgetown. Marian was promised to a planter's nephew whose family owned land along the Combahee. He presented it as protection, as prudence, as paternal duty. Marian's diary says she felt the room tilt. Evelyn, according to Agnes Doyle's later recollection, went almost white and spoke very little for the rest of the meal. Nathaniel mistook their silence for submission. Men like him often did. That night, the sisters met in Marian's room. Later letters suggest Isaac and Jonah were brought into the decision by the next evening. From that point on, the pace of the plan accelerated. Food was diverted in small amounts. A compass disappeared from Nathaniel's desk. A length of plain men's clothing was stolen from a laundry basket and cut down. It was copied, not from any map in the house, but from memory. Carriage roads to the ferry to Charleston, Charleston to whatever ship might carry 4 hunted people north under false names. What made the escape plausible was the very arrogance of the world they lived in. No one at Marshgate imagined the twins would choose to leave. No one believed 2 white daughters of the house could ever willingly vanish with 2 enslaved men. That assumption, more than darkness, was their cover. The diversion came 3 nights later. Just after midnight on February 26th, a fire broke out in the tar shed near the milling yard. Not a blaze large enough to consume Marshgate, but hot and sudden enough to rattle doors, wake the overseer, and drag half the estate toward buckets and shouting. By the time order returned, 4 people were gone. Nathaniel's first response was not grief, it was disbelief, then rage. The search began before dawn. Mounted men took the road to Charleston. Others combed the river edge and the pine track heading inland. Neighboring estates were warned. Patrols were told to watch for 2 dangerous fugitives and 2 missing white women presumed taken against their will. That phrase, presumed taken against their will, became the spine of the lie. It appeared in notices posted at ferries and churches. It was copied into county correspondence. It was repeated in drawing rooms by people who would rather imagine predation than consent. Within days, the story had hardened into local fact, because it was the only version that allowed the planter class to preserve its own logic. If the daughters had chosen this, then the disease was inside the house. If they had been stolen, then the order of things remained intact. Threatened, yes, but intact. For more than 2 weeks, search parties turned the district inside out. Dogs were brought in from a neighboring estate. A boat crew checked the inlets at low tide for traces of camp ash. The cabins at Marshgate were searched repeatedly, less for evidence than as a theater of domination. Men and women who knew nothing were interrogated as if ignorance itself were insolence. Agnes Doyle later claimed Nathaniel questioned even the kitchen children, as though terror might force the night to give itself back. Weeks passed. No bodies. No carriage. No confirmed sighting. Nathaniel Harrow stopped sleeping. Accounts from neighbors describe a man unraveling in plain view. He raged at the overseer. He questioned servants for hours. He ordered new searches into Savannah and Columbia. He offered money he could barely spare for information he never received. Then, in late March, a letter arrived bearing a Charleston postmark. No original copy survives. But 3 later descriptions of the letter agree on its effect. Nathaniel read it in his study, shouted for no one, knocked a chair backward, and within the hour collapsed to the floor, struck by what his physician called apoplexy. Days later. For decades, that collapse was treated as further proof of paternal devastation. A father broken by the loss of his daughters. But when Nathaniel's younger brother Silas Harrow came from Columbia to settle the estate, he discovered something that changed the meaning of everything. Inside a locked dispatch box in Nathaniel's study were 4 folded sheets. The first 2 were handwritten vows. Not legal by the standards of South Carolina, certainly not recognized by the slave system, but unmistakably intended as marriage declarations. One joined Marion Harrow to Isaac under the witness of God alone. The other joined Evelyn Harrow to Jonah in nearly identical language. The third paper was a letter, apparently written by Marion. In it, she stated plainly that neither she nor Evelyn had been taken. They had gone of their own will. They had left because their father meant to separate them forever. They understood the danger. They understood the shame. But they would rather disappear than return to a life founded on ownership and fear. The 4th sheet was the one that likely killed Nathaniel. It was not sentimental. That is what makes it so devastating. It did not ask forgiveness as much as name an indictment. If we stayed, one line read, we would live richly at the cost of other people's chains. We cannot do it and remain human. Silas Harrow now faced a choice. He could tell the truth, which would destroy the Harrow name, confirm his nieces had rejected their class and race loyalties, and publicize a scandal the region would not merely judge, but feast upon. Or he could protect the family myth. He chose the myth. Publicly, Silas maintained the abduction story. Privately, he sealed the papers away. Search efforts slowed, then shifted. The living daughters became presumed dead daughters. The two enslaved men became monsters in local retellings. Predators, deceivers, proof of what planters had always claimed free thought in black men would produce. And there, for a while, the case might have remained. A false fire, a vanished quartet, a grieving father, a respectable lie. Except history has a way of leaking. In the summer of 1866, more than a year after the Civil War ended, a woman arrived at what remained of Marshgate and asked to see Silas Harrow. The estate was already diminished. The labor system that built it was gone. Storm damage had gone unrepaired. Fields once manicured into profit now sat partly choked with weeds. But the house still stood, and so did the family instinct for secrecy. The woman called herself Mrs. Marion Quinn. The resemblance, according to a servant who later gave an interview, was immediate and terrible. Older, thinner, darker from years outdoors perhaps, but unmistakably one of the missing twins. Her meeting with Silas lasted nearly 3 hours. No transcript exists, but a letter Silas wrote to his wife that evening, discovered in a university collection in 1961, tells us enough. And said she had come for 2 reasons. First, she wanted a small miniature portrait of her mother and a prayer book she had left behind in haste on the night of the escape. Second, and more importantly, she wanted the record corrected. She wanted it acknowledged that she and Evelyn had not been kidnapped. They had not been seduced into ruin. They had chosen. And the men blamed for their disappearance had in fact risked everything to help them all reach freedom. She also carried news. Evelyn was alive. Both couples had survived. There were children now. Children growing up in places where the Harrow name meant nothing and could claim no ownership over them. Silas refused. He called the truth indecent. He wrote that to publish it would stain his brother's memory beyond repair and reduce the Harrow family to a cautionary spectacle. He offered Marion money instead, whether out of guilt, fear, or the old arrogance of believing everything could be settled with payment, we cannot know. What we do know is that Marion left the next morning. Within the year, Silas sold the remaining core of Marshgate and moved inland. Again, the truth was buried, but not deeply enough. In 1959, during restoration work on a collapsing side wing of the old Harrow house, workers opened a narrow cavity behind the paneling of an upstairs room. Inside, wrapped in yellowed muslin, was Marion's diary. It covered just under 16 months. Not enough to explain everything. Enough to destroy the official story. The diary confirmed that the sisters knew exactly what they were doing. It confirmed the fire had been planned as a distraction. It confirmed both relationships. It confirmed that the central struggle was not merely romantic, but moral. Marion wrote again and again that once she understood slavery not as inheritance, not as law, not as custom, but as daily theft enforced by terror, her former life became intolerable to her. Even more striking, she wrote with no illusion about the risk. If we fail, she noted weeks before the escape, the punishment will not fall equally. That sentence alone has kept some historians from dismissing the diary as fantasy. She understood the structure she was rebelling against. She knew who stood nearest to the whip. And yet she went. The diary also revealed something else. The 4 were not running blindly. They had help. A free black sailor in Charleston. A woman connected to an African Methodist congregation. A cart driver willing to ask no questions. For the right timing and the wrong price. By piecing the diary together with later shipping records, researchers concluded the group reached Charleston within 2 days, hid there under assumed names, and boarded a northbound coastal vessel carrying timber and rice casks. That finding was strengthened in 1963, when a shipping ledger surfaced listing 4 passengers added at the last minute. Mr. and Mrs. Quinn. Mr. and Mrs. Reed. Kind of record no one would have noticed if not for everything else. From there the trail split. Marion and Isaac seem to have settled first in Philadelphia, where city directories from 1853 list an Isaac Quinn working in a horse yard and dray stable near a black neighborhood west of the river. Baptism records from an AME church later show 2 children born to Isaac and Marion Quinn within 5 years. A tax notice from 1858 suggests Isaac had managed to lease enough equipment to run a small hauling concern of his own, which is astonishing when one remembers that less than a decade earlier South Carolina law treated him as property that could be sold. Evelyn and Jonah moved on after a shorter stay. By 1854, tax rolls and workshop accounts placed Jonah Reed in New Bedford, Massachusetts, earning money as a carpenter and later a cabinet maker. An 1856 school subscription list includes Mrs. Evelyn Reed among those teaching younger children their letters in a back room attached to a chapel. A former daughter of the slaveholding class, now teaching immigrant and black children in a room warmed by a coal stove and pooled candle wax. History can turn on scenes that small. Think about the violence packed into those plain records. A woman raised to command enslaved labor teaching children to read in a northern chapel. A man once counted as property billing customers for finished woodwork under his own chosen name. Lives so ordinary on paper they almost disappear, which may be why they survived. Then, in 1967, another piece emerged. At an estate sale in Philadelphia, a leather journal was found in the false bottom of a writing desk. Inside were entries signed simply Isaac Q, covering the years from 1852 into the late 1850s. The journal changed the emotional weight of the story. Until then, too much of the case had still been filtered through white family archives. The planter's letters, the sister's diary, the uncle's defensiveness. Isaac's journal restored a perspective the official record had tried to erase. He wrote of the 6-week journey north, of hiding under sacks in a wagon while patrolmen inspected the road, of Marion whispering a lie so steadily that the man searching the cart believed her, of nights when they slept in salt marsh reeds and did not dare build a fire, of the strange shock of waking in a city where freedom was possible and yet never fully secure. He also wrote of grief. He had left people behind, kin, friends, a whole world of the trapped. Freedom did not cancel that weight. One entry from 1853 is almost unbearable in its restraint. Marion sometimes stands at the window when ladies in silk pass by, he wrote, and I know she remembers what she abandoned. I do not fear she regrets me. I fear only the cost by which she came. That line cuts through every easy version of this story. Whatever this was, it was not rescue fantasy, not innocence, not romance floating above politics, or people trying to build something human out of a system designed to make that impossible. The journal also suggests the families never felt fully safe. After the Fugitive Slave Act hardened Northern complicity in slave catching, Isaac recorded a new vigilance in their household. Curtains shut earlier, letters burned after reading, children told never to repeat names spoken only inside the home. Freedom existed, but it existed with one ear always turned toward the door. Researchers in the late 1960s also uncovered anonymous letters published in abolitionist newspapers between 1854 and 1858, likely written by Marion and Evelyn under false initials. The pieces condemn slavery not from outside, but from the contaminated intimacy of those raised inside planter households. One letter describes slaveholding as a machine that teaches the child to mistake comfort for virtue. Another warned Northern readers not to believe tales of gentle mastery. There is no gentle form of owning a soul, the writer said. By then, enough fragments existed to reconstruct the larger truth. The Harrow sisters had not been snatched from safety. They had rejected the safety offered to them because it required moral blindness. Isaac and Jonah had not stolen them. Together, the four had engineered a joint escape from a world that would have destroyed them if it could. Still, even after the war, full freedom remained complicated. Federal law had changed. Human suspicion had not. The families kept aliases longer than necessary. They moved houses more than once. They told edited versions of their origins to their children. Not because the love was false, but because history had taught them exactly what truth could cost. Marion was widowed in 1874, according to Philadelphia death records for Isaac Quinn. Evelyn outlived Jonah by several years in Massachusetts. Descendants later recalled two elderly sisters who wrote to each other faithfully, who avoided discussing Georgia in public, and who kept one locked box each that no child was allowed to open. One granddaughter, interviewed in the 1970s, remembered being told only that the family had come north under circumstances too painful to explain to children. Another descendant said she did not learn until adulthood that her great-grandmother had been born in a plantation house. The silence was protective. It was also a wound. One of those locked boxes surfaced in 2001 during the renovation of a row house once linked to a 19th-century boarding family. Inside was a small gold locket containing two miniature portraits, young women in stiff collars and dark ribboned hair, their faces almost impossible to distinguish. Wrapped behind the portraits was a scrap of paper, "For the day our names can be spoken plainly." Maybe Marion hid it before returning south in 1866, maybe Evelyn kept it and it traveled later. No one can prove that part. But the sentence fits the rest of the evidence too perfectly to ignore. So what, finally, are we looking at when we look at this case? Not a fairy tale. Not a scandal fit for gossip columns retrofitted as romance. And not a clean moral parable, either. The Harrow sisters were born into privilege made possible by atrocity. Nothing can soften that. Isaac and Jonah were born into a world determined to reduce them to assets. Nothing can be discussed honestly without that fact standing in the center. What makes the story endure is not that love somehow erased those realities. It is that conscience broke through them anyway. Marion and Evelyn chose to betray the system that had shaped them. Isaac and Jonah chose to trust that betrayal enough to stake their lives on it. Together, they forced a crack in a world that called itself natural and godly while feeding on coercion. The men who stayed behind tried to control the narrative. Nathaniel with his authority, Silas with his box of hidden papers, County Memory with its preferred lie of abduction. For years that lie worked. A weathered marker put up near the old crossroads in the early 20th century still called the incident a tragic disappearance. No mention of Isaac. No mention of Jonah. No mention of choice. Even memory, when carved in stone, can serve power. That may be the most haunting part. Not only how much courage it took to run, but how easily power rewrote the run as a crime committed against innocence rather than a refusal of evil. How many other stories ended that way? How many women disappeared into official pity because the truth of their choices was more threatening than the fantasy of their victimhood? How many black men were turned into villains in records written by the people who owned them? How many acts of moral revolt were sealed in attics, folded into prayer books, tucked behind walls, and then nearly lost? The Harrow case survives only because the cover-up was imperfect. A diary hidden in paneling, a shipping ledger no one meant to preserve for drama, a church book, a journal in a false-bottom desk, an uncle's angry letter. A locket saved for some future day when names might be spoken plainly. Fragments. That is all history often leaves us when power has something to hide. And yet fragments can still indict. Fragments can still testify. Fragments can still force the dead to surrender what they meant to keep. Imagine the final night at Marshgate. The tar shed catching flame. Bells clanging. Men running with buckets. Smoke crossing the rice fields. For figures moving through darkness toward the road. Not knowing whether they would reach Charleston, or be dragged back by dawn, or die unnamed in a ditch before freedom ever took shape. Imagine Marion carrying the prayer book she later came back for. Imagine Evelyn refusing to look back at the house. Imagine Isaac calculating every sound. Imagine Jonah listening for hoofbeats behind them. No swelling music. No guarantee. No certainty that love would survive terror, or that principle would survive hunger, or that the North would prove much kinder than the South. Only a decision to step out of the life the world had written for them, and into one they would have to invent at terrible cost. That is the heart of the story, not the plantation, not the columns, not the gossip, not even the disappearance. The choice. The moment 4 people decided that an uncertain freedom was better than a comfortable lie. And for nearly 18 years, the people with the most power did everything they could to make sure no one ever heard it that way. But the papers remained. The names resurfaced. The lie weakened. And now, when we speak of the Harrow sisters of Marshgate, we are no longer speaking about 2 women who were stolen. We are speaking about 2 women who walked away. 2 black men who refused the role history assigned them. And a case built on the assumption that class, race, and fear would bury the truth forever. They almost did. Almost. Somewhere in the dark of February 1851, 4 people disappeared from a South Carolina plantation. What vanished that night was not just a family scandal. It was the illusion that the house on the hill had ever been whole to begin with.